Hey, I'm Damon Garcia, bringing you some perspective from the Christian left, and today we're talking about how Rosa Luxemburg was right that when you want to help poor people, when you want to help end poverty, charity is not enough, particularly if you're a Christian. So we've been going through this document from 1905 called Socialism and the Churches, written by Rosa Luxemburg, and it's been great. This is part 3, so you need to watch part 1 and 2 probably to understand everything we're talking about. Link is in the description. Check those out. So let's talk about this. Part 2 was about how all the ways that the early church was a communist society in the sense that they shared all of their property, shared everything they had. But we also mentioned that there are ways that it wasn't communist because it just shared property and it didn't share the means of production. It didn't share the work. It only shared the wealth. So in this early Christian community, everyone that joined would sell all their possessions and then give the money to a common pool, and then all that would be distributed among everyone according to their needs. And yet the rich would still remain rich and the poor would still remain poor, because this was a community that pretty much just existed on the concept of charity. So in part 3, she continues to make these distinctions and talk about how the early church wasn't exactly communist enough and the ways that they could have been better, and ultimately how charity isn't enough. So let's get into this. Part 3. Thus, the Christians of the 1st and 2nd centuries were fervent supporters of communism, but this communism was based on the consumption of finished products and not on the work, and proved itself incapable of reforming society, of putting an end to the inequality between men and throwing down the barrier which separated rich from poor. For exactly as before, the riches created by labor came back to a restricted group of possessors, because the means of production, especially the land, remained individual property, because the labor for the whole society was furnished by the slaves. The people, deprived of means of subsistence, only received alms, charity, according to the good pleasure of the rich. So, that's what we've been talking about. While some, a handful, in proportion to the mass of the people, possess exclusively for their own use all the arable lands, forests and pastures, farm animals and farm buildings, all the workshops, tools and materials of production, and others, the immense majority possess nothing at all that is indispensable in production. There can be no question whatever of equality between men. In such conditions, society evidently finds itself divided into 2 classes, the rich and the poor, those of luxury and those of poverty. Suppose, for example, that the rich proprietors, influenced by the Christian doctrine, offered to share up between the people all the riches which they possessed in the form of money, cereals, fruit, clothing, and animals. What would the result be? Poverty would disappear for several weeks, and during this time the populace would be able to feed and clothe themselves. But the finished products are quickly used up. After a short lapse of time, the people having consumed the distributed riches would once again have empty hands. The proprietors of the land and the instruments of production could produce more thanks to the labor power provided by the slaves, so nothing would be changed. Because ultimately, the people who are doing all the work in order to create these products are the poor, not the rich. Well, here is why the Social Democrats consider these things differently from the Christian communists. They say, the Social Democrats say, we do not want the rich to share with the poor. We do not want either charity or alms, neither being able to prevent the reoccurrence of inequality between men. It is by no means a sharing out between the rich and the poor which we demand, but the complete suppression of rich and poor. We don't just want the rich sharing with the poor. We don't want those categories to exist anymore. This is possible on the condition that the source of all wealth, the land, in common with all the other means of production and instruments of work, shall become the collective property of the working people, which will produce for itself according to the needs of each. The early Christians believed that they could remedy the poverty of the proletariat by means of the riches offered by the possessors. That would be to draw water in a sieve. That wouldn't be enough. It doesn't work long term. Christian communism was not only incapable of changing or of improving the economic situation, and it did not last. At the beginning, when the followers of the new savior constituted only a small group in Roman society, the sharing of the common stock, the meals in common, and the living under the same roof were practicable. But as the number of Christians spread over the territory of the empire, this communal life of its adherents became more difficult. Soon, there disappeared the custom of common meals, and the division of goods took on a different aspect. The Christians no longer lived like one family. Each took charge of his own property, and they no longer offered the whole of their goods to the community, but only the superfluity. The gifts of the richer of them to the general body, losing their character of participation in a common life, soon became simple almsgiving, charity. Since the rich Christians no longer made any use of the common property and put at service of the others only a part of what they had, while this part might be greater or smaller according to the goodwill of the donor. Thus, in the very heart of Christian communism appeared the difference between the rich and the poor, a difference analogous to that which reigned in the Roman Empire and against which the early Christians had fought. Soon it was only the poor Christians and the proletariat ones who took part in the common meals. The rich, having offered a part of their plenty, held themselves apart. The poor lived from the alms tossed to them by the rich, and society again became what it had been. The Christians had changed nothing. Oh, that's so tragic to read. And yeah, that's what happens. In the same way that people critique communism and say, that only works in small groups, I would say the same thing for charity. Charity only really makes lasting change in very small groups, because as this group became larger, it just continued, the rich and the poor, and the division kept getting wider, like in every other community. The fathers of the church struggled for a long time, yet with burning words against this penetration of social inequality into the Christian community, scourging the rich and exhorting them to return to the communism of the early apostles. Saint Basil in the 4th century after Christ preached thus against the rich. He said, "Wretches, how will you justify yourselves before the heavenly judge? You say to me, what is our fault when we keep what belongs to us?" Hear that all the time from conservative Christians. I ask you, how did you get to that which you called your property? How do the possessors become rich, if not by taking possession of things belong to all? If everyone took only what he strictly needed, leaving the rest to others, there would be neither rich nor poor. She continues, it was St. John Chrysostom, Patriarch of Constantinople, born at Antioch in 347, died in exile in Armenia in 407, who preached most ardently to the Christians the return to the first communism of the apostles. This celebrated preacher in his 11th homily on the Acts of the Apostles said, now we're going to read a huge chunk from his homily here. He said, "And there was a great charity among them, the apostles. None was poor among them, none considered as being his what belonged to him. All their riches were in common. A great charity was in all of them. This charity consisted in that there were no poor among them. So much did those who had possessions hasten to strip themselves of them. They did not divide their fortunes into two parts, giving one and keeping the other back. They gave what they had. So there was no inequality between them. They all lived in great abundance. Everything was done with the greatest reverence. What they gave was not passed from the hand of the giver to that of the recipient. Their gifts were without ostentation. They brought their goods to the feet of the apostles, who became the controllers and masters of them, masters of the goods, not the people, and who used them from then on as the goods of the community and no longer as the property of individuals. By that means they cut short any attempt to get vainglory. Why have these traditions been lost? Rich and poor, we should all profit from these pious usages, and we should both feel the same pleasure from conforming to them. The rich would not impoverish themselves when laying down their possessions, and the poor would be enriched. But let us try to give an exact idea of what should be done. Now, let us suppose, and neither rich nor poor need to be alarmed, for I'm just supposing, let us suppose that we sell all that belongs to us to put the proceeds into a common pool, what sums of gold would be piled up. I cannot say exactly how much that would make, but if all among us, without distinction between the sexes, were to bring here their treasures, if they were all to sell their fields, their properties, their houses, I do not speak of slaves, for there were none in the Christian community, and those who were there became free. Perhaps, I say, if everyone did the same, and we would reach hundreds of thousands of pounds of gold, millions, enormous values. Well, how many people do you think there are living in this city? How many Christians? Would you agree that there are 100,000, the rest being made up of Jews and Gentiles? How many should we not unite together? Now, if you count up the poor, what do you find? 50,000 needy people at the most. What would be needed to feed them each day? I estimate that the expense would not be excessive if the supply and the eating of the food were organized and common. You will say perhaps, but what will become of us when these goods are used up? So what? Would that ever happen? Would not the grace of God be 1,000 times abundant? Would we not be making a heaven on earth? Yes. It's so interesting. Part of this radical faith that he taught was faith that things like this can happen, that we can actually put an end to poverty, that we can actually live in communities where we make sure everyone's needs are met. That's the type of faith he was talking about when he said, just have the faith of a mustard seed and that can move mountains. He wasn't talking about moving your own personal little mountains of, I really wish I had this, so I'm going to have faith that I'll receive this product or whatever, this thing that I'm praying will be in my life one day. No, he was saying have faith that's actually going to change society, that is actually going to lead to a real revolution of values in the entire world, that can actually lead to these kind of communities being real. And so when people of faith today say, that could never happen, that is not practical, all the things that Jesus said we should be hoping for are not practical. You can argue all day that they're not practical, and yes, there are plenty of really good arguments about communism really not being practical and can never possibly work. But if you're a Christian with faith, who believes in God and all that, that's not the world you're trained to live in. Like, are you kidding me? Telling me, well, yeah, that's not practical, so we're just not gonna try. That's not a Christian. It is always the role of Christians to say, it seems impractical, it seems like it won't work, but this is the best thing to do. This is what we're going to try to make the world into. This is what we're going to actually fight for. A community where everyone's needs are met. It seems impractical, it seems like it won't work, it seems like it'll probably fall in on itself, but we're Christians. So we have faith and we're going to put work to that faith to make it happen. Like we said in another video, and Rosa said, like, shouldn't people who follow Jesus, should the church and the church leaders be like the first ones to care about this stuff? Of course. Especially when you're people of radical faith. And like I said, you could argue and say, yeah, that's dumb to have that radical of faith. Like, come on, be realistic. Sure, you can make that argument. But recognize that's a non-Christian argument. And you can make non-Christian arguments fine. But if you're a Christian, we're called to have radical faith by the guy we follow, Jesus. And of course, we're called to put work to that faith. Rosa continues, if formerly this community of goods existed among 3,000 to 5,000 faithful and had such good results and did away with poverty amidst them, what would not result in such a great multitude as this? And among the pagans themselves, who would not hasten to increase the common treasure? Wealth, which is owned by a number of people, is much more easily and quickly spent. The diffusion of ownership is the cause of poverty. Let us take as an example a household composed of a husband, a wife, and 10 children. The wife being occupied in weaving wool, the husband in bringing the wages of his work outside. Tell me in which case this family would spend more, if they lived together in common or lived separately. Obviously, if they lived separately, 10 houses, 10 tables, 10 servants, and 10 special allowances would be needed for the children if they were separated. What do you do, indeed, if you have many slaves? Is it not true that in order to keep expenses down, you feed them at a common table? The division is a cause of impoverishment. Concord and the unity of wills is a cause of riches. If you didn't quite catch that, she's making this analogy of of course, a family who has everyone separated and everyone out on their own ends up costing way, way more. And a family that shares has to spend way, way less. She goes on to say, in the monasteries, they still live as in the early church. You know, the monks and nuns that gather together and live together in the monasteries and dedicate all their time to work and service and prayer. Yet the men of our times fear living that way more than they fear falling into the sea. Why have we not tried it? We would fear it less. What a good act that would be. If a few of the faithful, hardly 8,000, dared in the face of a whole world where they have nothing but enemies to make a courageous attempt to live in common, without any outside help, how much more could we do it today, now that there are Christians throughout the whole world? Would there remain one single Gentile? Not one, I believe. We would attract them all and win them to us. I think that's really interesting. Those who think it's completely impossible to live in these kind of communities where everything is shared and we live not out of luxury. It's a pretty interesting suggestion to say, why don't you go try living in a monastery? There's several communities like this. Monasteries very much like a commune. Just try living like that for a while and see how you like it. And people that I know who have lived that kind of life, I don't know anyone who's lived that life for years, except for people I've heard and read about on the internet, but from them and then just from people I know who just spent a little bit of time in those environments, they always seem to say, wow, when I went, I thought I was going to be freaking out because I didn't have this, I didn't have that, I didn't have that. And then when I went, I lived there, I realized how much I can survive without. How I don't really need all this stuff that I thought I needed in my life in order to survive. When people actually live that way, they start to realize, oh, this is way more simpler and I really don't need to live in excess and luxury. Pretty interesting suggestion, I would say, just to try it out. These ardent sermons of St. John Chrysostom were in vain. Men no longer tried to establish communism either at Constantinople or anywhere else. At the same time as Christianity expanded and became, at Rome after the 4th century, the dominant religion, because Constantine became Christian and stopped persecuting Christians and made it the official dominant religion, which meant they didn't have to meet in hiding, but now they're meeting in public buildings, and now people were wanting to become Christian just so they could cozy up with the emperor. Complete shift and change of the entire culture of Christianity. Extremely important to know how big of a shift that was. So, it became the dominant religion. The faithful went further and further away from the example of the first apostles. Even within the Christian community itself, the inequality of goods between the faithful increased. Again, in the 6th century, Gregory the Great said, this is an amazing quote, listen to this. He said this, "It is by no means enough not to steal the property of others. You are in error if you keep to yourself the wealth which God has created for all. He who does not give to others what he possesses is a murderer, a killer. When he keeps for his own use what would provide for the poor, one cannot say that he is slaying all those who could have lived from his plenty. When we share with those who are suffering, we do not give what belongs to us, but what belongs to them. This is not an act of pity, but the payment of a debt." I love this. He's saying, just because you don't steal, it's not enough. If you keep to yourself all these possessions and riches and refuse to give it to others, that in itself is stealing, because it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to everyone. It also reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis. He wrote in his document, The Joy of the Gospel, where he talks about capitalism and he critiques it a bit, and of course he does. He's Latin American, Latino, Argentinian, And Latinos have plenty of critiques for capitalism, with all the terrible ways that Latin America has been colonized again and again and again over the years. And Pope Francis says, the same way that we say, thou shalt not kill, we should also say, thou shalt not, to systems that cause so much poverty that it kills people. Everyone who believes that killing is wrong should also believe that these systems that cause the death of so much through poverty are also wrong. Alright, she continues, talking about all the sermons that were trying to communicate this to Christians. She said, these appeals remained fruitless, but the fault was by no means with the Christians of those days, who were indeed more responsive to the words of the fathers of the church than are Christians today. This was not the first time in history of humanity that economic conditions have shown themselves to be stronger than fine speeches. The communism, this community of the consumption of goods, which the early Christians proclaimed, could not be brought into existence without the communal labor of the whole population on the land as common property, as well as in the communal workshops. Again, saying it can't just be about sharing all the wealth, it needs to also be about sharing the work. At the period of the early Christians, it was impossible to inaugurate communal labor with communal means of production, because, as we have already stated, the labor rested not upon free men, but upon the slaves, who lived on the edge of society. Christianity did not undertake to abolish the inequality between the labor of different men, nor between their property, and that is why its efforts to suppress the unequal distribution of consumption goods did not work. The voices of the fathers of the church proclaiming communism found no echo. Besides, these voices soon became less and less frequent and finally fell silent altogether. The fathers of the church ceased to preach the community and the dividing up of goods because the growth of the Christian community produced fundamental changes within the church itself. So that's the end of part 3. Also, all this reminds me of a famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." It's not just about giving to the poor. It's not just about giving money to charities to help the poor and trying to help everybody who needs it. It's about trying to change a system that creates the poor, that creates people who are in need. That's what the kind of communism that Rosa Luxemburg is talking about here. And Christians, whether you're sympathetic to communist ideas or not, should listen to that, should pause and reflect and think, this society is creating the poor. Instead of just trying to do our best to give money to the poor, we need to restructure a society that creates the poor. Christians should at least just stop and think about this stuff. I'm not trying to get Christians to subscribe to the ideology of communism. I don't want Christians necessarily to subscribe to any full ideology, to just give their brain to a full set of ideas and not to ever question it. No. But I want Christians to be able to be skeptical and to think, and to try to think of the ways that we can change society, and to remember that Jesus called us to have radical faith, that we can change society. And so Christians should be on the side of people who are trying to radically change society in service of the poor. Something to think about. So, we're going to continue on this part 4. Oh man, part 4 really blew my mind. It talks about more and more the history of the church after this time and the creation of clergy. How did we get pastors and priests in the first place? How did we get to a place where the church was suddenly becoming richer and richer and richer, and how that totally changed the Christian vision? It's really awesome stuff. Thank you for watching this. Shout out Rosa Luxemburg. Thank you, Rosa, for providing us with this. And I hope to see you in the next video. Leave a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you want more. And I'll see you in the next video.